Hey, what's up you guys? Welcome back to my channel. So today I want to talk about all the common issues to look out for when buying a 3rd gen 4runner. The 3rd gen 4runners are available from 1996 through 2002, and they've been proven to be a reliable truck. You see them all over the roads, and many of them are actually used for overlanding, off-roading, and even adventure vehicles. But that doesn't mean they are without problems. Now, I'm not going to go over every trim option available or even do a complete vehicle walkthrough. I just want to show you guys all of the things that you need to look out for when considering this truck. These are some of the things that I have encountered myself that I wish I had known when I bought the truck, because those are some of the things you can use to actually drive the price down. So hopefully this video is helpful for you. So let's get into the video. Alright guys, first thing you want to check is to make sure that you don't have a completely rusted out frame. So what you want to do is make sure you check this lower trailing arm and make sure that right here is not completely rusted out. Normally you'll see like this whole thing has been eaten up by rust, and this whole thing can actually fall down, and that is one of the links that actually holds your axle in place. So you want to make sure that the frame is not completely rusted out. So you can see here, even though this is supposedly a California 4runner, it's actually not. It's actually from Canada, and it's actually decently not that rusty. But then again, I think I actually did a lot of rust reformer, and I actually painted this at one point, and it looks kind of normal now, but it actually is pretty rusty. I'll put a picture up of the rear axle to show you guys what I mean. But this is a telltale sign that you got a bad frame, and even if the rest of the truck looks amazing, because it probably will, you need to check to make sure that this control arm is not rusted through. And the easiest way to do that is, take a hammer and just bang on it a little bit. And if it goes completely through, then you have a bad frame. But this one is actually pretty good. It was all surface rust before. And also, if it's rusty, just know that you're gonna have a miserable time working on this thing down the road. So it's better if you can find one that's not as rusty. Okay, the next thing you want to check is to make sure that you don't have a bad transmission, because that's going to be a very bad day, and it's probably just as bad of a day as having a bad frame. And the easiest way to do that is to make sure that, well, one, you test drive the vehicle, but really the transmissions only go bad on these things if you don't have proper fluid in the transmission. So the transmission fluid is actually cooled by this radiator, and there are separate chambers inside, and over time as this radiator gets old, it kind of breaks apart, and the coolant and the transmission fluid mixes, and it ends up going into the transmission, and you actually get this pink milkshake looking mix. And the way you can check that is, one, you can pull the dipstick, and I'll show you guys that in a second, or you can open this radiator cap. Alright, so we're going to open this up, and again, make sure it's not hot. So this is what you want to see. You want to make sure that it is actual fluid in there and not milkshake. So this here is red fluid, which is the original color it's supposed to be. Sometimes you might see green, so you might get a green milkshake, but that's what you want to check for. And if you guys do see pink milkshake consistency in here, I would just walk away and not even bother with that 4runner. Another thing you can check for is to make sure that this radiator has been replaced before. And my radiator definitely has been replaced before, because the original radiator is actually a olive or brown color as it kind of discolors over time. Now if the radiator is brown, then most likely it hasn't happened yet, but just know that you're going to have to replace the radiator because you don't want to take that gamble. And the radiator costs about $120 or so for a brand new Denso, which is pretty much OEM, and you can just swap that out relatively easily. Another thing you can do is check if the previous owner actually bypassed the radiator, and they can do this by putting in an external transmission cooler, which they normally put right here in front of the condenser, and you can normally see it, and that means that they've bypassed the radiator completely and kept the whole system separate. And you can also do that as well if you end up buying a 4runner and you don't want to have this problem. But personally, I would just suggest you just replace the radiator, and then that way you know that it's all fresh inside and you won't have that problem. So you can check your transmission dipstick as well to verify that you don't have pink milkshake, and it's just this orange guy right here. Just pull this little tab back, pull it up, and you can see it's starting to get shiny, maybe. And you can see there's no pink milkshake, it's just transmission fluid, which tells you that, you know, it's normal. And you can check it to make sure that it's not dark and, you know, a little bit clear. That means the fluid's newer. But even if it's old, it's not the end of the world. Just take it for a test drive and make sure it shifts properly. You can always change the fluid. It's really cheap to change the fluid. Alright, since we're already over here, the next thing you want to check for is to make sure that you don't have a valve cover oil leak, because this is pretty labor intensive. I mean, it's not the hardest job, and you can actually see I have a little bit of wetness down there, so I'm probably starting to leak down there. I haven't lost any oil yet, so I'm just going to leave it. But you want to make sure that this valve cover, this thing right here, make sure that it is not leaking, and you can see it will drip onto the exhaust, and it'll start to kind of, you know, look like your car's catching on fire. But you can check all the way around. If you just kind of look there, you can actually see the whole thing and make sure that it's not leaking. It's pretty common for these to leak, and the job is, you know, you have to take apart all of this stuff right here, and then, you know, do the half moons and get some gasket maker, and it's just a lot of work, and you don't want to deal with that. And the shop's probably going to charge you a couple $100s if you were to send it to them. And the parts aren't that expensive, but you know, you don't want to deal with this job because it's actually a little bit more difficult, and that's why I kind of haven't really done it yet. But I haven't really lost oil. It's kind of like a little seep. One thing you can do is you can tighten that bolt down there a little bit more, like a really light amount, and that might make it go away. Just note that these bolts are not supposed to be tight. There's a spec to them, and they might feel loose when you do that. It doesn't mean that you need to tighten it down more, so just keep that in mind. And over here on this side, you can check the valve cover as well, and you can see on this side it looks a little bit better than the other side. I don't see any leaks. It looks a little wet back there, but nothing to be concerned about. If you guys checked out my oil change video, I actually showed you guys that I'm not burning very much oil at all, or losing oil for that matter. Alright, since we're already in the engine compartment, there's one more thing you can check. And if you bring a 10mm with you and a couple of extensions, you can actually take off the timing cover and you can look at the timing belt. And sometimes if your mechanic or if their mechanic did a good job, they'll put a little sticker on here and tell you when they last did it. You can see mine was done on February 22nd, 2006 at 92,900 miles. And my truck's got about 176,000 now. And it's April of 2020, so it's been about 14 years. But I contemplated about doing this because it is involved. You have to take all of this out and all that stuff. I wanted to wait till 200,000 miles, but the easy way to do that is you can take a little clamp, move this guy back a little bit, and then zip off all of these bolts, and then you can slide this back, and you'll actually get access to the timing belt. And I'll show you what mine looked like. I think I checked it about 6 months ago. I'll put a picture up for you guys so I don't have to remove it. But you know, this thing moves pretty easily. There's a couple bolts under here as well, you can't see it, and the one over here is the harder one to get to, the one down there. But you can feel for it, and once you get it off, you can slide it back. If you're buying it from somebody, they shouldn't mind that much. You're not really going to disrupt the truck at all. Just make sure you put this clamp back, and then make sure these wires don't get all messed up when you pull it off. You'll actually have to take this off as well. You see here there's a little clip, so just slide that off, and then you can pull the cover back and check the belt. And you want to make sure the belt is not cracking. You'll actually see stress marks in the belt. That means that it's probably old and time to replace it. Another thing that could happen, and it might happen to me, is just because the belt's good doesn't mean the water pump's going to last forever. And it might start leaking at some point, but it hasn't yet, so, you know, knock on this radiator here. Even if the belt does end up snapping on you, this motor is a 3.4 liter V6. It's actually a non-interference engine, so you actually don't need to worry about it. It won't bend any valves or anything like that. You'll just be stranded and you'll need to get a tow. But since I don't drive this truck that often, I figure I can wait till 200,000 miles. I actually have all the parts to do the job already. I've just been lazy, and I decided I'm just gonna wait till 200,000 miles. Now, if you notice that the timing belt is old, then you'll probably want to make sure you negotiate the price, because a timing belt job is probably going to cost you in the neighborhood of, you know, anywhere from $800 to $1,400. Kind of depends on, you know, who you take it to. If you know how to do it yourself, the timing belt kit itself only costs about $180 or less than $200.
and you could probably pay a shop maybe $300 to $500 to put it in for you. But just know that that's a pretty big price that you might have to pay if the timing belt was getting a little old. All right, next thing to check or ask the owner is if they actually replace this lower ball joint. See this guy right here? So this guy has a tendency to fail and fail catastrophically. I mean, it is a structural part holding your wheel in. Imagine if this separated, the wheel will go out like that. It would come out and probably rip out your CV and probably break your upper ball joint as well. And so you want to make sure and check if they actually replaced this recently, and ask them if they used the original Toyota part. Now they might have went cheap and used the aftermarket version, you know, like the Senkei 555 or Moog lower ball joints. You know, those have all been known to fail. I don't know, there's been a lot of controversy about this. The best bet is the OEM one lasted pretty long. The new OEM one should last just as long. And then also make sure that they change these bolts and use Loctite, because you don't want those coming loose. And a lot of people have said that these top ones have come loose before and actually, you know, rip through all the threads, and that's how they get their failure as well. So make sure that they actually got new bolts, and make sure you check both sides. Now, even if they didn't change it and it looks okay, it's probably a good idea to replace them anyways. It's probably going to cost you about $250 with the bolts on both sides for some new OEM ones, and it's not really that hard to put in. You just need one special tool or a hammer if you want to really bang on it, and then you just bolt it back in, and it's pretty simple, and that way you'll have peace of mind. Alright, this next one has to do with the rear axle. So I'm right under the differential here. These are the rear tires, and what you want to do is check that rear drum over there, and the one on the passenger side over here, and make sure that it doesn't have any oil on it. If it looks wet and it looks like it's saturated in oil, you want to make sure that you actually check the drums. It could just be the wheel cylinders are leaking, which is part of the brake system, which in that case, that's not that bad. But if it's actually the axle seals that are leaking, which is the oil that's coming from the differential, it's entering into the actual drums, then that means it's probably going to destroy the wheel bearing in the process and soak the shoes on the brake system, meaning that you have to replace the entire brake system as well as rebuild the entire axle because the bearings are now destroyed. And so a telltale sign is to just look for, you know, any type of oil on this, and sometimes it's actually in the wheel as well, because it's been leaking, and that will tell you if you have an axle seal problem. Now the axle seal itself is not very expensive, but the problem is if it's been going on for a long time, which usually it is, that means that the wheel bearings are destroyed as well. So you have to kind of rebuild the entire axle, and that can cost you about $300 in parts. And then depending on if you have an actual press and all the pressing equipment to kind of rebuild the axle, that might cost you another couple $100 at the machine shop if you have to take it to them. And then you also have to replace all the braking system and the hardware, and then, you know, do all of that, which isn't that hard, but, you know, adds to the costs. And the most common reason why it happens is because of the differential breather. So right on top of this pumpkin, you can't really see it, but there's a little cap, and I'll put it on the screen for you guys. And what ends up happening is that little cap becomes seized, and the pressure inside of the differential has nowhere to escape. Normally it escapes through the breather, and so it actually goes through the axle seals, and that's how you get your leak. And then once that happens, then it starts destroying your bearings in here, and then goes out to your brakes, and then now you have to replace everything. So make sure you check for that, because that can be probably a $600 to $800 job. That's assuming they're using aftermarket parts. I think I paid about $400 when I did it myself, and I just took my axles to the machine shop and they pressed it all in for me, and then I put everything back together. And one other way this can happen is if your wheel bearings are going bad and you're getting a lot of play, that'll actually cause the axle seal to leak, and then that'll destroy everything as well. But most commonly it's usually the breather up here on top of the pumpkin. Alright, so I want to say that those are all the major problems to look out for the 3rd gen 4runner. So now I'm going to talk about some of the minor problems. Remember, all these problems that you find are going to help you negotiate the price down, and also kind of let you know what you're getting yourselves into if you're going to buy that vehicle. So one thing that's common with the 3rd gen 4runner is these rotors will have a tendency to warp because they're actually undersized. So what ends up happening is when you apply the brakes, your steering wheel is going to shake quite a bit because these rotors actually start getting too hot and they start getting warped because they're undersized for this 3rd gen 4Runner. And especially if you go bigger wheels and you start putting mods on your truck and weighing it down, you know, sliders and all that good stuff, you definitely want to upgrade your brakes. So what you can do to fix this problem is you can actually go and buy some Tundra brakes and put them in. So I use a 2005 Tundra full drive, and that gets me the parts that I need, and it'll actually get me the bigger brake caliper here. And also you can get either an OEM rotor, which I suggest, or you can go with something else like a slotted one or something, I don't know. But these haven't given me any problems. The rotor, this one was like $80. The caliper, you're probably best to find a remanufactured one. I think a remanufactured one was like $80 when I bought this. Fortunately for me, I found the calipers at a junkyard and I just repainted them. And so I paid $80 for each of these, so $160. Plus I paid, I don't know what I paid at the junkyard, it was really minimal, probably $40. And then for the pads, I put OEM pads in here. I think they were about $60 for the complete set. And then all you need to do to put it in is just slice off a little bit on the dust shield and they should bolt right in. But one thing to keep in mind is if you go with the bigger Tundra brake upgrade, the bigger version, the 231 millimeter, you might have to get new wheels. If you have the factory 5-star limited wheels, then you shouldn't have a problem. But if you have the other wheel, like the split 6, you're probably gonna have to run spacers, so just keep that in mind. All right, speaking of steering wheel shake, you definitely wanna take this up to at least 70 miles an hour. Right at the 50 to 65 mile per hour range, you'll start to notice maybe a shake. And you want to make sure that you actually check for that because these vehicles seem to have an issue with tire balancing. And I've had about 3 sets of tires on this vehicle and they've all shook at 50 to 65 miles an hour. So if you notice steering wheel shakes, it's probably the tire balancing. Now this shake could be caused by other things. It could actually be wear in your bushings on the upper control arm or lower control arm. It could also be your steering rack. It may need new bushings, but most likely it's probably the tire balance. But you can use some of these tactics to kind of get your price down if you kind of know about this issue already. But it doesn't hurt to check those things. Now, if you have a constant vibration and it gets crazier as you drive faster, then that's a separate problem. That actually is a bigger problem. That means that your drive shaft is out of balance. Most likely the rear one. I mean, the front one is spinning as well if you have 4-wheel drive. But that means that that thing is not balanced anymore. And you might have to get a new drive shaft, which could cost you a lot of money. Now you can go to the junkyard and get one and it's probably okay, but you want to make sure you check that. So you got to drive the vehicle, get it up to a decent speed and see if anything is shaking or vibrating. You can check the mirror if it's vibrating a lot. Most likely, you know, it could be a drive shaft issue, but sometimes it can just be this, you know, balance problem. But if it's a balance problem, then you'll only feel it in the steering wheel. Now if you feel it in the chair or you feel it in the car, then definitely is a drive shaft problem. All right, so we're back down under here. This is the front tire, and I wanted to show you guys what the steering rack looks like and what you should look out for. So a lot of times that end link right there, it's not that critical, but you see this guy right here? A lot of times that thing is actually broken. And so just be on the lookout for that. Those things aren't that expensive. They're like $12 a piece for each side, and you can replace them pretty easily. But the steering rack, on the other hand, you want to make sure that there's no leaks in the boot here, and you'll notice it right away because you can see mine's all dry. If you notice there's like a little puddle on the bottom, then it's leaking, and that's not good. A brand new OEM steering rack is going to cost you about $600, and installation is probably 2 to 3 hours. So you're looking at close to $800 to $900 just to get it in there. And then you need a wheel alignment, and you know, you don't want to deal with that. Another common thing that goes wrong is these bushings. You see that red bushing right there? So I've already replaced mine, but there is that one. There's one over there where that this guy is. So in between there, and then there's one, let's see, right there in between there that goes vertical. So you can get a set of those. They'll cost you about, I think, $40 or $50 or something like that. But a lot of the times in these old trucks, those will go bad and they'll have a lot of play in them. And so you might have some steering problems if you have that. But just know that you can replace those pretty easily. All right, the next thing I want to talk about is this power antenna. So a lot of times the third gen 4runners, the antenna stops working. And the reason for that is because inside of here, there is a mast and it's made of plastic and it's like kind of like a geared looking thing. And the teeth on that mast, actually, it kind of just gets old and deteriorates and then it can't spin up with the motor. So the motor is actually still good in there. And what you need to do is, you know, undo this little thing right here, and you can see mine's a little loose already. And after that, you can actually pull the whole antenna out, and there's still going to be some leftover plastic in there that broke off. So you'll have to go down to the wheel well down here and open all of that up, and then you'll see there's a motor behind there. And once you take that out and clean everything up, you can put it back in, and then once you pull the old antenna out, so I'll kind of show you here a little bit maybe. So this antenna will come out completely, and you can buy a new one, and then you can feed it back in there with the radio on and off, and then you'll have a brand new antenna. So the antenna is going to run you about $60 for an OEM one, and once you do that, your antenna should work beautifully. All right, this next problem isn't that big of a deal, but for some it might be, and for me actually sometimes it is. But when you open this door, you'll see sometimes it doesn't want to stay open, and it's because the door checks over there are actually all broken, and so it'll constantly want to close on you, especially if you're trying to get kids in and you're trying to put their seat belts on. It constantly wants to close, and if you're on a hill, which we're at level right now, it'll constantly close, and it might drive you insane if you got a lot of little kids and you're trying to put them in car seats. But just know that those door checks go bad. This one's actually not bad on this side, but the other side, there is no door check. I mean, it's there, but it doesn't actually hold. This one actually has a stop right here, but I know any little tiny hill and it'll just go back. And those door checks are pretty expensive, so I mean, they're not necessary for the function of this vehicle, but you know, just know that that could be a problem. All right, the next item to look out for is purely cosmetic, probably, but you see how my 4runner sits pretty even? Well, obviously it does that because I have brand new springs and lifts and all that in here, but most of the 4runners will be sagging back here over time, and that's because the springs are just getting old, and over time it's gonna kind of lean like this, and it's gonna look very funny. But just know that once you put cargo back here, then it's gonna sag even more, and so it looks really funny. But just know that a lot of the springs on these 4runners, they start to sag, so you might have to get, you know, new springs to lift it back up. All right, we're inside the vehicle now, and I wanted to show you guys some other common areas that have problems. So up here, if you're looking at a moonroof option, this headliner has a tendency to leak, and it's because there's a little gasket out here, and it's a pretty easy fix. I think you can just put a whole bunch of silicone in there and it'll fix it, but you know, you'll get some water dripping in and you're gonna have a bad day, especially if you have to park this 4runner outside. And so you want to make sure you check for that, and just check for any water stains. Another common place for it to leak is actually down here. This is the driver's side door jamb, and right here is a very common place for it to leak, and that's because right behind here the firewall has a little hole where all the wires go through. So you can kind of see it's right there in the middle of the frame where all the other wires are going in. So you can see I've run a lot of light bars and stuff, and what happens is water gets through there and then it drains all the way down to here, and then it drains all the way down to here, and it makes a mess and it looks like rotten carpet. So if you have that problem, just know that it's probably leaking from that hole, and you can't really do a lot about it. I mean, it's a hole, it's not going to go away. You can't really put silicone in there, so just check on that. Since we're down here, another thing to be careful about is, you see this bolt right here that holds the chair down? Sometimes if you have a lot of rust, it will actually rust right through and you won't have a bolt holding this anymore. And you can fix it by getting washers and all kinds of stuff, but just know that if you got a lot of rust, this seat might not be anchored into the truck anymore. So right under here, and it's probably because of all that water that's coming down to here. So just keep that in mind. This one's another common issue, and it's not that big of a deal, but sometimes there's a lot of play in this shifter, and there's a little bushing in there, and it takes a little bit of work to pull all this out to get to it. Mine has a little bit of play, but you know, it hasn't caused me any problems, so I don't really mind. All right, so we're at the climate control area here, and another common problem that you'll notice is the clock actually doesn't work all the time. Now I have this little mount in the way, but when I first bought this truck, the clock actually didn't work. And sometimes it's as easy as getting the plug and plugging it actually into the clock, but just know that that clock might be broken. It doesn't cost that much. I think it's about $40 on eBay or something like that. You can find them at the junkyard as well. But you know, you also have the option of using your radio for the clock as well, so not a big deal. Another thing that also happens a lot is you see all these little buttons. They actually light up when you turn on the lights. Let me turn off the light here. So what ends up happening is a lot of these lights actually don't work after a while. So like this is supposed to light up, at least I think it is. These didn't light up originally, so when I replaced the bulb, then everything started to light up. And then even in here, in the glove, there's actually a bulb in here. And you can see this one works now. You can also see I have an N95 mask, Treasure. But a lot of these bulbs are pretty easy to replace, and they don't cost very much money, but just know that some of them might be out, and I went and just replaced them all with LEDs. All right, the next thing you want to check for is a faulty gas gauge. And this actually happened to me when I bought my vehicle. It was kind of stuck at the quarter tank mark right here. And you know, when you would fill it up, it would only show up at 3/4. And so the gas gauge was completely off when I bought this thing. And the funny thing is, I actually bought this from another nearby city, and it was at a quarter tank. And I went and drove it home, and it actually died on me right before I got home. I was about 2 or 3 miles away from home, and the car kept dying, and I thought I bought a lemon. And my wife was getting mad, and it wasn't a pleasant time. And what ended up happening was it was just out of gas. And I knew that because, you know, it would still start up once in a while, and I actually got it to the gas station barely. It actually wouldn't even go up the hill to get to the gas pump. That's how close it was. But I was able to get it up there, you know, after a couple more cranks and hit firing. I got the gas in, I pumped it all the way to full, and I noticed that it was still at the 3/4 mark. And so I knew something was up, and it ended up being a faulty gas gauge. And I actually fixed it for free. And I found out that in the back where the fuel pump is, I had a bad ground, and I just re-grounded the wire, and it fixed the gas gauge, and now it reads properly. It reads full when it's full. So you can see here, let me see. It should be pretty full. So there. So you can see I've driven about 20 miles, and you can see it's pretty full. Now prior, it would be stuck at this 3/4 mark only. And then when it got to the bottom, it would just stop at the quarter mark, which is really strange. Now it goes all the way down to the E, and even goes even a little bit more if I keep driving it, but it seems to be pretty accurate now. All right, if you're looking at a 4runner that has a rear locker and you see this little button and they advertise a rear locker, make sure you don't trust this button. Now, people can buy this button and pretty much, you know, put it in there if you want. Make sure you actually press it, and you can probably hear it a little bit. Let me see if the audio will pick it up. So that's the actuator on the differential. And so make sure that you actually hear that noise, because a lot of people out there, you know, if you don't know any better, they'll just put this switch in here and just advertise it, you know, and they'll pretend that it has a locker, and you don't really know, because most people don't use their locker that often. And, you know, they think, oh, here's a 4-wheel drive shifter, and they may have thought it has a locker. So make sure you actually check. Now you can actually crawl under there and look and make sure there's a actuator, and we're gonna do that in a little bit here. But make sure that you don't get fooled by this locker button. I mean, this is the OEM button, but you need to crawl under there and actually look. Now my 4runner didn't have a locker. This is actually a retrofit. So you can see anybody can just put this little, you know, locker button in there. Okay, so this is the rear driver tire, and you can see if you just go right under here and you look up, you can see right there in the middle of the frame, that is the differential locker actuator. So if you see that, then that means that you do have a differential locker. Now if you don't see that, then that means that that button's fake. So make sure you see this, and just like what I showed you earlier, make sure you press that button, because you'll hear the actuator, And you want to make sure that the actuator actually works, because you don't want to have a seized actuator. The actuator is very expensive, and you definitely don't want to have to buy another actuator. Alright, then obviously the last thing you want to do is make sure that you actually start the vehicle and drive it, and make sure you check all the lights on the instrument panel. Make sure there's no lights. There shouldn't be any showing up. Let me show you. And also, since you're buying a 3rd gen 4runner, 1996 through 02, you actually have a OBD2 port that you can plug into to check for codes. So if you look right under the steering wheel, right under this little panel right here, that's where the OBD2 port is. Let me show you. So you can see it is right there. So you can plug it in, and then you can scan for codes. And make sure that the owner hasn't cleared all the codes.
So there you have it, guys. A bunch of issues you might want to consider when looking at a 3rd gen 4runner. I know that list was pretty long and the video was pretty long, but at least now you have a comprehensive list that you can go through when you're actually buying this vehicle. Now you obviously want to check some of the common things. Just go download any vehicle checklist and make sure you go through those things. But these are some of the common things that often go wrong with a 3rd gen 4runner. Now you're probably wondering, why the heck would I buy something like this if there's so many issues? Well, as you saw in my video, a lot of them are actually preventative. You can actually prevent a lot of those things from happening by just buying a new radiator, or changing out the lower ball joints, or buying a truck that isn't rusty. But you have to remember that some of these trucks are actually over 20 years old, and most people haven't changed a thing on them. And so you really can't expect a plastic radiator to last, that long, or lower ball joints to last forever. And so these are things to just check for and make sure that they're actually been replaced. And if not, you can try to negotiate your price down. Or even if they're in good shape, just know that there are some issues with them and you have to address them yourself. So now you know all of the issues and the potential cost of the repairs. You can use some of this to now negotiate the price. Now obviously you're not going to be able to throw everything at the owner. The owner is probably going to look at you crazy. Now let's say you found a 4runner that had a rear axle seal leak, and let's say gear oil was all over the drum or the wheel like I mentioned. Well, you can use that to kind of negotiate your price, and you can probably knock off $500 or maybe $1,000, because that repair is probably going to be pretty costly. And so you can use some of the information in this video to get yourself a better deal. Now, I'm not going to tell you what you should pay for your 4runner, because that really depends on the option, the trim, where you live, how much rust you have, how many miles are on the vehicle. But you can find 3rd gen 4runners anywhere from $2,500 all the way up to $7,000, or maybe even a little bit more. I wouldn't pay any more than that unless it's like a pristine 5-speed, with really low miles or something like that. But you can actually get these for a really reasonable price, and they actually run really well. Alright guys, hopefully this video was helpful. If it was, don't forget to hit the like button. And if you have a friend looking for a 3rd gen 4runner, make sure you share this video with that person. And if I forgot anything, make sure you leave a comment down below so I know. And if you like content like this, consider subscribing. Have a nice day.